In the first gray light of October 25, 1944, the sea off Samar looked deceptively calm. The faint glow of dawn stretched in thin ribbons across the Philippine waters, painting the sky with soft pastels that hid the violence soon to erupt. For the men of Taffy 3, the small escort carriers and their screening destroyers guarding the northern approaches to Leyte Gulf, the day began like any other, routine operations in support of the massive American landings ashore. They had no reason to expect that within hours they would find themselves face to face with the largest and most powerful Japanese surface fleet assembled since Pearl Harbor. Among the ships preparing for another day of operations was a compact, weary destroyer, USS Johnston, DD-557. She was a Fletcher-class vessel, thin-hulled, lightly armored, lightly gunned compared to the great battleships that dominated naval strategy, but she was fast, aggressive, and commanded by a man whose very presence seemed to transform steel and machinery into something more audacious. That man was Commander Ernest Evans. Evans was a warrior out of another age, part tactician, part gambler, part poet of battle. A Native American of the Cherokee and Creek nations, he projected an air of calm determination that masked the hard edges of a fighter who believed deeply in duty. When he took command of Johnston a year earlier, he had told his crew plainly, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along better get off right now." No one left. Now, as October 25 dawned, Johnston slid through the waves in its defensive position south of the escort carriers Gambier Bay, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Fanshawe Bay, expected a morning of normal combat air support, bombing Japanese positions, patrolling skies, the routine grind of naval aviation. They did not know they stood between the Japanese Navy and the entire U.S. invasion force at Leyte. They also did not know that Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the Japanese Center Force, including the massive battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was bearing down on them with overwhelming firepower. Battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Against them, Taffy 3 had 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and 6 small escort carriers. It was not a fair fight. It was not even a fight that should have lasted more than a few minutes. But it became one of the most heroic stands in the history of naval warfare.
At 0646, the lookout spotted something strange on the northern horizon. Dark shapes, large ones, too big to be anything but capital ships. A moment later came the unmistakable flash of muzzle blasts. High-velocity shells began falling around the escort carriers. One landed a mere 1,000 yards from White Plains, throwing a column of water skyward like a geyser. The call went out across Taffy 3. Enemy fleet, battleships and cruisers closing fast. Shock rippled across every deck. Taffy 3 was never meant to fight battleships. Their escort carriers flew aircraft, but they were slow and lightly armored, essentially floating airstrips. Their destroyers were thin-skinned and small. What they needed to do was run, dodge, delay, and survive until help arrived. But Ernest Evans had another idea. At 0658, without waiting for orders, without hesitation, and in direct defiance of the logic that said a destroyer had no business charging a battle fleet, Evans gave the command that changed history. Full ahead, prepare to attack. Johnston heeled sharply as she accelerated to flank speed. The crew looked at one another in disbelief. They were turning directly toward the entire Japanese fleet, charging battleships with guns that could swat a destroyer out of existence with a single hit. But Evans did not flinch. He was already on the bridge wing, binoculars raised, calling targets as calmly as they were practicing in peacetime. The sea erupted around Johnston as the Japanese heavy cruisers Chukai, Haguro, and Kumano zeroed in. Massive 8-inch and 14-inch shells screamed overhead. Every near miss sent walls of water smashing onto Johnston's deck. The destroyer shook with the concussion of heavy gunfire, but Johnston kept advancing. Evans' strategy was simple: get close, uncomfortably close, inside the optimal gun range of the enemy cruisers and battleships. Destroyers were small, fast, and surprisingly hard to hit at short distances. And if Johnston could close the distance, she could launch her torpedoes, one of the few weapons capable of sinking capital ships. At 0704, Johnston's forward turrets opened fire. They hammered the leading heavy cruiser Kumano. The shots were accurate, shockingly accurate. Johnston's shells smashed into her cruiser's superstructure, knocking out her forward turret and killing key personnel on her bridge. The Japanese column wavered briefly, but Johnston was still outgunned 100-1. At 0710, Evans gave the order, "Torpedoes, stand by!" Johnston raced through curtains of black smoke and geysers of seawater. She swerved violently as Evans zigzagged to avoid the incoming fire. Lookouts watched in astonishment as massive projectiles, the size of telephone poles, missed them by meters, throwing steam trails across the sky. Finally, at 0716, Johnston reached a range of 10,000 yards, within torpedo distance. Evans shouted, "Fire!" 10 torpedoes streaked out, white wakes trailing behind them. Moments later, an explosion tore through the Japanese cruiser Kumano. A torpedo hit had blown off her bow entirely. The once formidable warship slowed, bleeding water, falling out of formation. Johnston had just crippled a heavy cruiser. But the cost came swiftly. The Japanese battleship Kongo spotted Johnston and fired a full salvo. One shell slammed into the destroyer's forward section, wrecking the port engine room. Another hit disabled steering temporarily. The lights flickered, smoke filled compartments, and casualties mounted. But the crew fought the fires, sealed the compartments, and restored power. Johnston dropped to 17 knots, but she did not stop. Evans ordered another attack run. By now, the rest of Taffy 3's destroyers, USS Hole and USS Heermann, and the destroyer escorts were charging forward as well. Inspired by Evans' bold lead, they launched their own torpedo attacks. The sky filled with smoke, tracers, and courage. The small ships of Taffy 3 were creating an illusion. To the Japanese, this looked like a major American battle group bravely counterattacking. Kurita hesitated. His formation began to lose cohesion. Even Yamato had to turn away temporarily to avoid torpedoes, removing the most powerful battleship in the world from the fight for precious minutes.
At 0730, Evans realized the escort carriers, vital to the Leyte invasion, were still exposed. Johnston, wounded but operational, began laying down a smokescreen to shield the carriers. She placed herself directly between the enemy guns and the slow-moving American carriers. Japanese shells targeted Johnston relentlessly. Multiple hits tore through her hull. A shell struck the bridge, wounding Evans and killing several men instantly. Shrapnel tore into his face and clothing. He wiped the blood away and kept commanding. Communications were failing, guns were jamming, yet the crew fought with every ounce of determination. One survivor would later recall, "Johnston kept firing until she had nothing left to fire." Meanwhile, the escort carriers launched every aircraft they could, fighters, torpedo bombers, even planes without bombs or ammunition. Pilots attacked with whatever they had, machine guns, depth charges, empty fuel tanks. They strafed Japanese warships again and again, buying time. This combination, destroyers charging capital ships and unarmed aircraft harassing cruisers, was so chaotic and so aggressive that Kurita misunderstood the situation. He believed he had been lured into a trap. And so,
At 09:20, despite his massive advantage, he issued the order to withdraw. The Japanese fleet turned north, abandoning its attack. Taffy 3 had done the impossible. But not all would survive to see the Japanese retreat. By 09:30, Johnston was barely afloat. She had taken dozens of hits. Fires burned uncontrollably. Flooding filled compartments. Her speed was down to 6 knots. Ammunition was nearly gone. Evans stood exposed on the fantail, shouting orders directly because the sound-powered phones were destroyed. His uniform was shredded, his face was burned, yet he encouraged his men, telling them, "Keep firing as long as you can." By 09:40, Japanese destroyers closed in and opened fire at close range. Johnston's remaining guns barked defiantly. At 09:45, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Survivors recalled the destroyer rolling slowly to starboard as water filled her hull. Her battle-scarred superstructure slipped beneath the waves. Many men floated in the oily water for hours, some for days, before rescue came. Commander Ernest E was last seen assisting wounded crewmen off the ship. He did not survive. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest award. The battle off Samar became legendary. A handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts had charged a vastly superior fleet, battleships, heavy cruisers, and dozens of warships, and drove them away. USS Johnston's gamble changed the course of the engagement. It bought precious time. It disrupted the Japanese formation. It inspired Taffy 3's defenders, and ultimately, it forced a confused Japanese admiral to retreat. Johnston's wreck was finally located in 2019 by deep-sea explorers, resting more than 20,000 feet below the surface, the deepest shipwreck ever found. The damage seen on her hull told the story of a ship that fought until she physically couldn't fight anymore. In American naval history, few stories rise to the level of myth. This is one of them. The day when a single destroyer, outgunned and outmatched, charged battleships. Not because it made sense, not because victory was possible, but because, as Ernest E believed, if his men did not fight, tens of thousands of Americans landing at Leyte might die. His decision was not a calculation. It was conviction. Courage distilled into action. And in that moment, under fire, outnumbered, bleeding from the bridge wing of his doomed ship, Evans showed the world what resolve looks like when everything is at stake. Few actions in naval warfare demonstrate the raw essence of heroism as clearly as the charge of USS Johnston. Few commanders embodied the spirit of defiance as completely as Ernest E. And few battles have ever proven so decisively that sometimes the boldest gamble is the one that saves everyone else. This was the day a destroyer charged battleships. This was the heroic gamble of USS Johnston. And this is how history remembers those who choose to stand when standing seems impossible.